virtual reality is a technology for showing each other the contents of our own heads. And I know how I could sit down with a design team and build a DMT trip. It would take months and cost money. But when it was over with, you would be able to drop on the helmet and put on the gloves and do it.
How would you do that? Could you spell that out a little bit more?
Well, for example, you know how I'm always talking about how they show you these objects. Well, one way to design one of these objects is, let's try for a simple one. Let's just take a basic dodecahedron. It has 12 surfaces. So we'll get 12 programmers of the level of genius of Yoichiro Kawaguchi, we'll say. Each programmer gets one facet of the dodecahedron, and they're told, you know, design of trip. Then we have to have a massive parallel processing machine to run this, because we're going to run all 12 programs simultaneously, and the dodecahedron will be rotating in space, and as a facet comes by, you'll see that programmer's trip running on that facet.
Great.
But you get 12 at once.
Multiple points of view.
Yeah, well then you pierce it,
Splendid.
then you morph it to something else, and you begin to... Morphing is interesting. Morphing is what DMT objects do. There wasn't a word for it until the computer came along. But a coffee cup which changes into a telephone, which changes into a mouse, which becomes a wristwatch, which becomes the Hope Diamond.
Analogs to dream logic.
Right. And again, I not, well, like Interval, if I could get them by the throat, you know who I'm talking about? Yeah, Brenda's people, and say, you know, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to spend as much money and as much time as it takes, but we'll produce a world so bizarre where every surface is a doorway into other surfaces.
So you've got our total alignment on that, because that's what we've been talking
really,
about. I
yeah.
mean, we have no concept of how to do it, but we saw that possibility with virtual reality, that you could take what this technology is presenting us as possibilities, you know, and just have a...
Well, I never got
Unbelievable.
along with Jared or was comfortable enough with him to see what he did with his stuff, but it seemed to me it was always, they were like stagecrafters. They never understood that the idea was to not to produce virtual realities, but to produce virtual hallucinations. Kawaguchi and the guy you featured in this month's Mondo, and there are probably half a dozen other people in the world that good, should then be encouraged to make these things walk in.
Well, I have another idea, which is hand motions and creating iconic forms that would be related conceptually to the kind of DMT experience you want to recreate with the animation. So that eventually, and by process of feedback, and I've been working this idea of a VR environment for self-entrainment, in which you teach the machine to recreate the mental state, which then in turn recreates the mental state. And what eventually you do is by just simply thinking it, you then direct the machine, if that makes sense. So that then David Warner, it turns out, at Lum Linda has been working on similar lines. So he's got the technology for doing that. So what I like to do is take his techniques, which is, let's assume this all happens, okay? And then we could create essentially any experience you want. It's the experiential typewriter theory talked about. This, I think, we're right at the verge of being able to do that. So I think one then has to say, well, to stimulate enough people to actually create this, what would it take? And probably what it would take would be some kind of socially redeeming value to all of this. So then what would that be?
Well, the socially redeeming value is that you actually reconstruct people's expectations of what reality is capable of and capable of being. I mean, you show... See, I really think that the mind is folded into three-dimensional space by evolutionary constraint. And that what happens on psychedelics is that the mind unfolds 4, 5, 6 more dimensions. And the thing is, if DMT weren't so terrifying, you could spend more time in there. But it feels... There is a part of you that is very anxious for it to stop. Now, if you could over and over again reassure yourself that you're not dying and could somehow gain strength, I mean, I think you would actually almost have to train people like astronauts to not freak out in the presence of this stuff. And the reason we went to ayahuasca was because we said, if we could get into the DMT state for an hour rather than 45 seconds, you could really come out with something. But, what we came out with was 2 careers and a history of psychotic reversal and a universal map of time. And, we're still being propelled outward from the blast of that one encounter, which is there on the other side. Ralph Abraham is the designated remote user for the MPPI machine at Goddard Space Flight. That's the machine that can do what I'm talking about.
Well, explain, what does that machine do?
Massive parallel processing integrated machine.
Okay.
It's the fastest computer in the world, and it's a parallel processing device.
Right.
So when you describe even this simple program I described to you with the dodecahedrons, everybody says no machinery can run something like that. It would run so slowly, and you want it to run blindingly fast.
Right.
I don't know. I'm going down to Interval this month and to try and pump them up. I don't know what they're doing with their $100 million.
$100
but
million? Really?
That's how much he gave.
Who gave them?
What's his name? Gates' partner, Paul Allen.
Oh, wow. Okay, good, got it. Interesting.
With that kind of money, you ought to be able to do something worthwhile.
Very interesting. Now, this all ties in with the future of multimedia and the future direction of civilization, doesn't it?
Well, the transcendental object at the end of time is this thing we're trying to image. What we're doing is they're drilling through the mountain toward us, and we're drilling through the mountain toward them. And the idea is that 2012 we meet, and then we then have the fully functioning simulacrum of the transcendental object, and then they say, okay, now step out of the trainer, here's the real thing, folks. That's basically what the idea is to image. I mean, I see it very clearly. I know exactly how it should behave. I mean, it's flubber for intellectuals, It's a form of matter which behaves like the imagination, and it's the unconscious mind made conscious. It's the distant made present. It's the coalescing of human intentionality and technology into an object which, when you finally figure out what it really is, it's the human soul itself, drawn out of the body and hung with bells and whistles and made a technological artifact. I mean, all tools, every chipper, every scraper, everything is an effort to approximate the ultimate tool. That's why computers are so interesting, because, you set the switches one way, it predicts the weather. You set the switches another way, it plays a good game of chess. Another way, it balances your checkbook. This kind of omni-adaptable technological matrix is what we're moving toward. But we have a long, long way to go. We want to build a perfect mirror for the unconscious. And when we do that, we will discover, who it is that looks out through the monkey eyes and from the monkey body. And it is no monkey trapped inside of us, but the peacock angel of hyperspace that has somehow been lodged in the mere flesh of human beings. And sexuality, certainly. All these things about us that are so peculiar are parts of the puzzle. Our extreme hypersexuality, our extreme obsession with language, our extreme obsession with exteriorized technologies, symbolic activity of all kinds, our appetite for the future. If you could meld all this in the correct proportion, then you would get the Peacock Angel on time.
Billy Idol has a song that's going to come out in this new album that's going to be released pretty soon. It's called The Age of Destruction. And we did a sort of prototype Lindo video for him. And in this song, I got the impression that it was a response to that song in the 60s, I think it was, by Barry McGuire, We're on the Eve of Destruction.
Right.
This one is, now, we're at the age of destruction, so it's sort of for the 90s, what maybe that song did for the 60s.
Well, or Dylan's song Desolation Row is, about looking at the end of history somehow. It's really frustrating to me. I mean, it's so close, and it's a problem of articulation, which is my special department. I mean, if we could articulate it, we could do it. And I feel like the pieces lie around, Mondo, interval, VR, nanotech, psilocybin, the stuff I'm doing, and yet apparently only on its own schedule, only in its own time can it be born. And until then we're condemned to the dreary fact of being visionaries, which I don't particularly find a comfortable position. I'd rather get it out where people can see it.
It would seem to me that we can either view this 2012 experience as the end of this life, and that we're racing toward it, or we can view it as this mystery that we have no idea what it's going to be. And do you have that experience that we're racing toward it, or is your experience more that you're going to dance toward it?
Well, it can't come fast enough for me. I think each person can approach it on their own terms, that waiting for the end of the world is not the right approach. We should live as though the apocalypse has happened. And then that all becomes moot,
We're on the other side.
Yeah, you're on the other side. And to a degree, we're all doing that. And when you go to places like Camden or south of Market, and you